What began as a simple farming endeavor would soon become a nightmare that still haunts my every waking moment. And by the end of this tale, you'll understand why some mysteries are better left unsolved. My flock of 32 lambs grazed peacefully in my newest and southernmost paddock, a mix of newly purchased animals and some from my own breeding stock. With only 2 rams remaining last November, I had faced significant losses due to unfortunate cases of fly strike that claimed several of my breeding males. My new ewes had not birthed many lambs during the previous spring season, leaving me concerned about the future of my operation. However, fortune smiled upon me when one ewe birthed quadruplets, each marked with a distinctive white dot on their forehead. 4 healthy lambs from a single mother represents an extraordinarily rare sight in the farming world. A local farmer named Jonathan suggested consulting with a farm veterinarian who arrived dressed entirely in black and provided crucial supplementary milk for the newborns. I had to bottle feed the quad lambs 4 times daily, as their poor mother simply couldn't produce enough milk to sustain all 4 offspring. Tragedy struck when one of the lambs passed away mysteriously between morning feeding sessions. An unknown cause had claimed the young life, leaving me devastated and searching for answers. Jonathan whispered solemnly that the land taketh what you owe, though at first I dismissed this as merely old farmer wisdom expressing condolences. Incineration seemed far too cruel a fate for such a young creature, despite being the standard process for deceased livestock. Instead, I chose to bury the body deep within my fields, alongside other animals that had passed naturally over the years. I hoped that my respectful treatment of these creatures would return to me in the form of good karma and nutritious grass for my remaining livestock. The 3 surviving triplets, now 6 months of age, resided in the paddock I mentioned at the beginning of this tale. Their late birth meant they were too young for breeding and remained separated from the mature ewes as we prepared for the new season. These triplets had grown larger than the rest of my flock, a clear sign that the supplementary milk feeding had been successful and properly administered. This represented a proud achievement for someone relatively new to the challenging world of farming. The land I now owned had belonged to a relative on my father's side and was eventually passed down through the family line. After my father's death, this land he had owned but never wanted was given to me as an unexpected inheritance. It required extensive renovation and significant financial investment, but I had received tremendous support from the nearby farming community throughout the process. Even though they found it strange that I suddenly wanted to become one of them after years in a completely different profession. After months of intense studying to ensure proper animal care and welfare, I ultimately decided to start with sheep as they seemed the most manageable option. Unfortunately, I severely underestimated just how difficult and unpredictable these animals could truly be. Now here's where I need you to become part of this community, because what happened next defies all logical explanation. So please, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell to give this channel the strength it needs to bring you more unexplained stories like this one. And don't forget to check the description below for details about our ongoing mystery giveaway contest that could change your life forever. 2 weeks ago, I visited my lambs during the morning routine only to discover them walking continuously in an almost perfect circular pattern. They had been walking all night, as evidenced by the autumn grass being completely worn down by their constant trampling hooves. I entered their flight zone, which normally would have sent them fleeing in terror from my presence. However, the lambs continued their march with their lower halves completely coated in thick mud and their eyes appearing glazed and unfocused. Not even my farm dog Holly's aggressive barking and strategic nipping could break them from this mysterious trance-like state. In fact, They nearly trampled her as she attempted to disrupt their relentless circular movement. The other local farmers and I initially suspected listeriosis, also known as circling disease, but this theory became problematic when other paddocks remained unaffected. Despite feeding on the same supplementary hay, no other animals showed similar symptoms or behavioral changes. It appeared as if their flock mentality had somehow activated, causing them to attempt escape from some invisible threat or presence. As unknown visitors arrived to observe this phenomenon, it quickly became a local area mystery that attracted significant attention. Even the local news media took interest in the matter, sending reporters and camera crews to document the strange behavior. However, nobody yielded any practical solutions or reasonable explanations for what we were witnessing. In desperation, I released one of my mentally stronger ewes into the affected paddock, hoping the lambs would recognize her authority and break free from their trance. Initially, she stayed clear of the group and grazed peacefully on the available grass around the perimeter of the field. But eventually, she too was drawn to the circle as if some invisible magnetic force was compelling her to join their endless march. The other farmers remained unsure of action, as this behavior had been reported in sheep confined to small pens for extended periods. However, with the vast paddock available to them, this explanation simply didn't make logical sense given the circumstances. Jonathan generously lent me several of his sheepdogs to attempt breaking up the formation, but the animals remained tightly packed and completely unresponsive. I reached out to multiple veterinarians but was unable to track down the mysterious one who had helped me with the quadruplet situation months earlier. Jonathan continued helping with various tasks, even providing me with a breeding EWE to aid with my upcoming lambing season. Each veterinarian that visited suggested listeriosis as the most likely culprit, though none could explain why it affected only one specific group. Some veterinarians theorized that the soil in the paddock had somehow become contaminated with harmful bacteria or toxins. Complete nonsense. I told them, explaining that the lambs had access to my supplementary hay as frost began claiming the fields during nighttime hours. November's cold rain flooded the entire area and created increasingly thick layers of mud that made movement difficult for both animals and humans. Day by day, the lambs' constant pathing formed what resembled a moat around the central patch of grass that remained mysteriously dry. Despite everything happening around it, that patch of land in the middle maintained perfect condition, while chaos reigned in the surrounding area. Some lambs began passing away by day 10, their starved and weakened bodies being trampled and crushed by the remaining members of their dwindling group. Soon enough, the moat became so deep that I could only observe the tops of their heads as they continued their relentless circular march. The local farmers visited every other day, equally intrigued by this unprecedented phenomenon that defied all their collective experience and knowledge. They watched with focused eyes and raised eyebrows as if the sight triggered some deep primal memory or understanding that remained just beyond conscious reach. Each day they witnessed a drop in numbers as more lambs succumbed to exhaustion, starvation, and trampling. Yet none offered their condolences or emotional support. With fewer living animals remaining, I employed a pulley system to lift the deceased corpses from the increasingly treacherous, muddy ground below. Most bodies were completely floppy, their consistency resembling beanbags due to broken bones and crushed internal organs from days of trampling. Some were ripped apart from spending extended periods lying at the bottom of the formation while others continued their march above them. Once cleared, we used the same pulley system to trap and extract one living lamb from the group to examine its condition and mental state. When we successfully brought it to the surface, the lamb exhibited extreme distress and violent thrashing as it desperately attempted to return to the circular formation. When we physically restrained the animal, It whipped its head around so wildly and intentionally that it deliberately broke its own neck rather than remain separated. Things like this happen. Jonathan assured me in his characteristically calm and soothing voice that somehow made the horror seem almost natural. He asked if I had spoken to the veterinarian who helped with the original quad situation, mentioning he never got the man's contact information after that mysterious visit. I'll give it a try, he promised, though he warned that this particular veterinarian was notoriously difficult to reach when needed most. When I visited the paddock this morning, the air felt thick with moisture that seemed to cling to everything it touched. The fog was suffocating and foreboding, creating an atmosphere that made breathing feel like drowning in the humid, oppressive environment. The grass beneath my feet felt unnaturally soft, as if the damp air had mixed with mud to create an almost spongy surface. Between phlegmatic coughs caused by the moisture, I peered carefully into the deep moat that had formed around the central island. Initially, I heard nothing despite knowing that 4 lambs, including the 3 surviving triplets, had been alive just the night before. I doubted they would make it through another night given their deteriorating condition and the increasingly harsh environmental conditions. And then I heard it clearly cutting through the oppressive silence that had settled over the entire area like a burial shroud. A wet, slippery noise filled the air, resembling the sound of someone repeatedly squishing a completely saturated sponge with tremendous force. As I crouched closer to the moat edge, the sound grew significantly louder. But despite my efforts to focus through the fog, I could only make out dark shapes moving below. My feet shuffled away from the edge instinctively, fearing that some mysterious figure might emerge from the fog to push me into the depths. An intense bleating sound erupted from below, harsh and loud, yet muffled as if emanating from beneath the surface of water or thick mud. Suddenly, a rhythmic thudding echoed from the depths, creating a percussion that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath my feet. My flashlight illuminated water droplets in the air and revealed the faint shadow of one of the remaining lambs moving in the murky depths. I watched in horror as it repeatedly slammed its head against the dirt wall with tremendous force, an apparent determination to cause self-harm. 2 other thumps in the distance followed each impact, suggesting that all remaining animals were engaged in this self-destructive behavior simultaneously. Instinctively, I shrieked in terror and desperately tried to reach into the depths to stop the lamb's self-destructive actions before it was too late. My fingertips brushed against the muddy wool coat of the creature below, and I recognized it as one of the larger dog coats I had given the triplets. Crackling sounds trickled into my ears, resembling either faulty electrical wiring or the violent reaction between water and extremely hot oil. Initially, the sound was nearly impossible to hear over the constant thudding, but it grew progressively louder and was accompanied by strange vibrations in the ground. I noticed that the central island had begun to crack and break apart as if the foundation itself was being destroyed from within. I pushed myself back onto my feet and took several steps backward, afraid that the spreading cracks would infect the ground I stood on and swallow me entirely. I watched as the center caved in like a massive sinkhole, with the hole growing exponentially larger as it consumed the remaining dirt and vegetation. Soon there was just one giant hole inside what had once been the protective moat surrounding the mysterious central island. Suddenly, the AIR became light and all the disturbing sounds ceased completely, leaving an eerie silence that felt more terrifying than the chaos. No more cracks. No more thudding. Absolutely nothing but the sound of my own rapidly beating heart creating the soundtrack to my overwhelming panic. With unsteady feet, I approached the newly formed hole once again, driven by concern for any surviving animals that might be trapped within. I feared that the remaining lambs had become stuck in the collapsing mud, and that my responsibility for their welfare outweighed my personal safety. To my surprise, 3 lambs remained standing in place on a small mound that had survived the collapse of everything around them. The small mound wriggled and squirmed as if something living was trapped beneath its surface, desperately trying to escape. Fearing that one of my lambs was suffocating underneath, I jumped into the hole without considering the potential consequences of my actions. I clawed desperately at the damp dirt until mud coated my hands and crawled under my fingernails as I searched frantically for signs of life. Finally, I made contact with something ice cold that felt distinctly different from the surrounding mud and organic matter. It was a small lamb less than 1 month old, which immediately struck me as impossible since lambs are only born during spring months. Initially, it appeared completely dead, but bore the same distinctive white dot marking as the original triplets I had raised from birth. I was almost certain this was the same lamb I had buried in my field several months earlier after it died mysteriously between morning feedings. When it stood up on all 4 legs, with surprising firmness and stability, I felt a shock that nearly caused me to lose consciousness. My instinct was to cover it with a blanket and provide warmth, but something about this lamb felt fundamentally wrong and unnatural. It seemed to be controlling the air around me, as if we were both the same end of a magnet, creating an invisible barrier of repulsion. I stumbled backward from the mysterious force, nearly tripping over one of the hoof crevices that marked the endless circular path. The 3 remaining lambs stepped forward in perfect unison and prostrated themselves before the central figure in what appeared to be worship. The act was practically cultish and more sacrificial than anything I had ever witnessed in nature or human behavior. There was a sense of purpose in their coordinated movement, as if they had been working toward this specific moment for weeks. I called out loudly, followed by a sharp whistle, but they didn't spare me even the slightest glance of acknowledgement. I knew with certainty that they had heard me calling, yet chose to completely ignore my presence and authority as their caretaker. There was something different in their behavior now compared to the mindless trance they had maintained over the previous weeks. They seemed to have awakened from the trance and were now acting with clear intention and disturbing intelligence that defied natural sheep behavior. Frantically, I scanned the surrounding area for any sign of human presence that might help me understand or resolve this nightmare situation. It was unlikely that someone would be on my private land, but after 2 weeks of media attention, my property had become an unexpected tourist destination. Just beyond the paddock fence and through the lessening fog stood a dark figure dressed entirely in black clothing. Perhaps another farmer had arrived to check for updates on the situation, though something about this presence felt fundamentally wrong. I opened my mouth to call out to the figure, but found myself completely lost for words and unable to form coherent speech. What was I shouting for? And more importantly, what exactly constituted an emergency in this increasingly surreal situation that defied rational explanation? An impactful crack flooded the entire area, followed by several less harsh sounds that seemed to echo from multiple directions simultaneously. I turned my head and witnessed in absolute horror as one of the smaller lambs deliberately stomped and crushed one of the triplets' heads. Although I had encountered plenty of corpses during the previous several days, this deliberate act of violence felt fundamentally different and more disturbing. My mouth flooded with saliva and stomach acid as my body's natural response to extreme trauma and revulsion took immediate control. The pressure became too much for my lips to contain, and soon I was violently painting the ground with the contents of my stomach. When I looked back, the aggressive lamb had begun feasting on the viscera and internal organs of its former companion with apparent satisfaction. I screamed desperately for it to stop this behavior, waving my hands dramatically to appear large and intimidating while my voice cracked with emotion. My throat burned from the mixture of stomach acid and last night's meal that had been forcibly expelled during my violent reaction. The lamb completely ignored my commands, and with that same invisible force pushing against me, I could only watch in disgust and helplessness. It turned toward another triplet and repeated the same horrific process of deliberate murder and consumption with mechanical precision. In just seconds, it all became too overwhelming for my mind to process, and I felt my sanity beginning to fracture under the weight of witnessing such unnatural horror. Erratically, I climbed out of the hole and desperately searched the surface for any sign of help or human intervention. But the mysterious figure had vanished completely, leaving me alone with this nightmare that seemed to exist outside the normal rules of reality. I was completely alone with whatever force had taken control of my animals and transformed them into something fundamentally evil and unrecognizable. I called through the thick moisture for help, pleading desperately for the shadowy figure to return and provide some explanation or assistance. The skull burst and cracking sounds echoed again as the remaining lamb made contact with its final target among the triplets. I didn't have to look to know what was happening, because I simply couldn't force myself to witness another deliberate act of cannibalistic violence. Feeling completely helpless and abandoned, I ran as fast as my legs would carry me away from this scene of supernatural horror. No matter how far I fled from the immediate area, I couldn't escape the vivid images burned permanently into my memory and consciousness. The atrocity that had happened right in front of me was barbaric, unexplainable, and left my stomach churning with continued nausea and psychological trauma. When I had created significant distance from the hole, I risked one final look back toward the scene of horror that had unfolded. My feet continued stumbling ahead as I spotted multiple dark figures standing eerily around the crater, staring down into the depths with apparent fascination. It was difficult to make out any identifying features through the fog, but their presence felt menacing and somehow connected to the supernatural events. Suddenly, the surrounding EWEs and rams in all my remaining paddocks began bleating in perfect unison as the shadows moved and shifted around the hole. I didn't stick around any longer, fearing that I owed the land much more than I could ever hope to give it in return for my trespass against its ancient rules.